When we picture medieval queens, we often imagine jewels, gowns, and golden crowns. But beneath that glittering surface was a hidden reality most people today would find revolting. Behind palace walls, even the most powerful women lived in ways that were shockingly unhygienic. Their beauty rituals were strange, their habits disgusting, their private lives filled with secrets history books rarely tell. This was not simply carelessness. Medieval Europe had a very different understanding of health and cleanliness. Bathing was feared because doctors warned that hot water could open the pores and invite deadly diseases. Soap was a rare luxury, and perfumes were used not for beauty, but to cover the unbearable stench of bodies, clothes, and chambers that rarely saw water. Queens, though wealthy, were trapped in the same filthy beliefs. Their status gave them jewels and castles, but it did not save them from the smells, stains, and sicknesses of their world. In fact, some of their habits made them even more disgusting than the common people. From rotten teeth hidden behind royal smiles to chamber pots emptied in shocking ways. But their secrets reveal a side of history we were never meant to see. What makes this darker is how these unhygienic practices weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. Diseases spread quickly, childbirth was a deadly risk, and infections festered in royal courts. The queens we imagine as untouchable symbols of grace often suffered from lice, fleas, and foul odors that could not be ignored by those around them. Each secret reveals not just personal disgust, but a system where filth was normal and even celebrated. These women were dressed in silks, but beneath the layers, their bodies carried the smell of unwashed skin. Their hair held lice combed with jeweled pins, their teeth blackened while their servants whispered behind closed doors. And as we step deeper into this world, we'll uncover 7 of the most revolting hygiene practices of medieval queens, rituals that might make you rethink everything you believed about royal life. The first of these secrets lies not in the body, but in the mouth. Because when a queen smiled, the truth behind her teeth was nothing like the glittering image painted in portraits. One of the most shocking hygiene secrets of medieval queens was their teeth, or what was left of them. We imagine queens smiling with pearly whites, but the reality was far darker. Their diets, their lack of dental care, and their strange beauty rituals left their mouths in a horrific state. Sugar was one of the most prized luxuries of the medieval world. It was rare, expensive, and considered a sign of wealth. While peasants barely tasted it in their lifetimes, queens and noblewomen indulged in sweet cakes, candied fruits, and honeyed wine. But this royal privilege came at a cost. Their teeth rotted quickly, turning black, breaking apart, and leaving them in constant pain. What made it worse was that dentistry barely existed. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, and no professional dentists. At best, a servant might rub their gums with a cloth soaked in vinegar or herbs, but this did little to stop decay. When a toothache grew unbearable, the solution was brutal. An iron tool used to yank the tooth straight out, often without any form of pain relief. Infections from these crude extractions could kill. By the late medieval period, black teeth became so common among wealthy women that some actually displayed them as a sign of status. A rotten mouth was proof you had enough wealth to afford sugar. In other words, what disgusts us today was once considered fashionable. Imagine a queen sitting on her throne, her lips parting to reveal dark stumps where her teeth should have been symbols of wealth, but also of suffering. And this was not just an issue of beauty. The stench of rotting teeth filled the royal courts. Chronic bad breath, bleeding gums, and abscesses made queens smell as foul as they looked. Court physicians wrote warnings about mouth rot spreading disease, but still, the habits continued. Rotten teeth were only the beginning, because what lingered beneath their gowns, where daily life left its mark, revealed an even darker and more disgusting secret of royal hygiene. If the smiles of medieval queens revealed decay, their underclothes told an even dirtier story. One of the most disgusting hygiene secrets was how rarely they changed or even owned their undergarments. Unlike today, when daily washing is normal, medieval queens often wore the same linen shift for weeks, sometimes months, without changing it. Bathing was feared more than it was practiced. Many physicians believed water carried diseases into the body. Hot water, they said, opened the pores, allowing sickness to slip inside. Because of this, queens often avoided baths altogether. Some might sit in perfumed water once or twice a year as a luxury ritual, but regular bathing was unheard of. Instead, They layered clothing to cover the filth. Undergarments made of linen, absorbed sweat, menstrual blood, and every stain from daily life. Washing them was difficult, and servants often had to boil the garments to remove lice. Yet even boiling did little to kill the parasites that thrived in the folds of fabric. Queens slept in the same dirty clothes, ate in them, and sat in them through hours of court ceremonies. The stench became unbearable. Accounts from visitors to medieval courts describe the foul odors of noble women, hidden behind layers of perfume and rosewater. But perfumes were not for attraction, they were shields, trying to mask the reek of unwashed flesh. Even when queens did bathe, the process was hardly clean. They soaked in wooden tubs, where servants poured in herbs, oils, and sometimes even wine. But the same water might be shared among several people before it was emptied. Instead of washing away filth, baths often spread it. This dirty habit of rare bathing in filthy underclothes made queens living hosts for lice and fleas. These pests crawled through their hair, into their gowns, and across their bodies. The scratching was constant, the discomfort daily. Yet this was considered normal, not shameful. And the worst part? These queens were the most privileged women in their kingdoms. If royalty lived this way, imagine how much worse it was for the common people. But disgust did not stop here, because when it came to relieving themselves, queens carried a secret habit that was even more disturbing than their undergarments. Behind the heavy doors of castles and palaces, medieval queens lived surrounded by velvet and gold. But when nature called, their reality was anything but royal. Another disgusting hygiene secret was the way queens relieved themselves, and how their waste was handled. Toilets as we know them did not exist. Instead, queens relied on chamber pots, small containers, often made of metal or ceramic, that they used in private chambers or even during long ceremonies. These pots filled quickly, and servants were tasked with emptying them, often into castle moats, rivers, or simply out the window. The stench lingered everywhere, clinging to halls and bedrooms alike. In some castles, garderobes were built tiny rooms with holes and stone benches, leading straight down into cesspits or the open air. But these too were far from clean. Waste piled beneath the castle walls, seeping into the ground, spreading foul odors and disease. Queens, despite their status, sat in these primitive latrines, swatting flies as they relieved themselves. The problem was not just the act itself, but the aftermath. Servants who cleaned chamber pots were often careless, spilling waste on floors or carrying it through hallways where courtiers walked. In winter, when windows stayed shut, the smell of urine and feces filled the air until it became impossible to ignore. Some records tell of queens keeping chamber pots near their beds during the night, hidden under covers or behind curtains. When the pots overflowed, the stench reached even the most decorated chambers. Guests who visited royal courts often wrote of being horrified by the smell, even in the presence of queens who were supposed to embody elegance. Even worse, medical beliefs of the time sometimes led queens to use their own waste in treatments. Some physicians recommended applying urine to the skin to cure rashes, or mixing dung with herbs for strange remedies. For a queen suffering from illness, such cures were considered worthy of trial. So while portraits show queens sitting with poise and dignity, the truth behind their closed doors was shockingly different. Their palaces may have gleamed on the outside, but inside the stench of human waste was unavoidable. And yet the filth did not stop at their toilets. Because the food they ate, the very meals served at royal banquets, created another secret that made queens' hygiene not just disgusting, but deadly. The dining halls of medieval queens were filled with roasted meats, sweet wines, and golden platters stacked high with food. But behind the spectacle of these feasts was another disgusting hygiene secret: the food itself. What queens ate, and the way they ate it, it led to rotten breath, foul digestion, and dangerous diseases. A crown may shine with jewels, but it cannot hide what lives beneath it. One of the most disgusting hygiene secrets of medieval queens was their constant battle with lice and fleas. Even the most powerful women in Europe were never free from crawling parasites that fed on their skin and hair. Daily bathing was rare, and hair washing even rarer. Queens often wore their hair long, covered with veils, hoods, or elaborate headpieces. These layers created the perfect, warm, dark environment for lice to thrive. Servants combed their hair with fine-toothed combs, But no matter how often the combing was done, the lice always returned. Eggs clung to the hair shafts, hatching again and again. Fleas were even harder to escape. They lived in the straw mattresses, rugs, and heavy gowns that filled royal chambers. Queens often awoke with bites across their bodies, scratching their skin until it bled. Physicians warned that fleas carried diseases, but there was no true way to get rid of them. Instead, herbs and flowers were scattered in bedding, not to kill the pests, but to mask their smell. Some queens even wore small bags of herbs or animal fur close to their bodies, believing the scent would drive the insects away. But these remedies did little. The scratching continued, the bites became infected, and the queens lived in constant discomfort. Worse still, these parasites spread to everyone in the court. Servants, courtiers, and even kings were infested. Queens who shared their beds with kings or mistresses also shared their lice. In some cases, outbreaks of fleas and lice became so severe that entire palaces were fumigated with smoke butt once the smoke cleared. The pests always returned. The irony was cruel. Queens might wear gowns worth a fortune, embroidered with gold thread, yet underneath they scratched like peasants. Their crowns could not protect them from the tiny invaders that feasted on their bodies. These infestations were not just uncomfortable, they were deadly. Fleas carried the plague which wiped out millions in Europe. Queens, like all others, were vulnerable. Their filthy living conditions made disease impossible to escape. And yet lice and fleas were still considered normal, part of daily life. But what was not normal, what shocked even their own contemporaries, was how queens handled the most private of matters: their monthly bleeding. Refrigeration did not exist in the medieval world. Meat spoiled quickly, especially in summer. To hide the taste and smell of rot, cooks smothered food in heavy spices, vinegar, or wine. Queens dined on these dishes without knowing how rotten the ingredients had become. Worms and maggots often infested stored grains and bread, but hunger and tradition meant they were still consumed. The result was constant stomach trouble. Queens suffered from bloating, constipation, and food poisoning. But instead of blaming hygiene, physicians blamed the stars, humors, or even sin. Treatments often made things worse. For example, doctors sometimes recommended drinking wine mixed with crushed pearls, or ground-up animal parts remedies that poisoned more than they cured. Table manners only added to the filth. Forks were rare in much of medieval Europe. Queens and their guests often ate with their fingers, wiping greasy hands on the same shared cloths, or even on their gowns. Servants carried bowls of water for rinsing, but the water was rarely changed, leaving it cloudy and filled with scraps from dozens of fingers. The mouth suffered most from this diet. Sugar and wine eroded teeth, while rotting food particles lodged between gums. Chronic bad breath became a common complaint, so strong that courtiers recorded the stench in letters and diaries. Queens masked it with cloves, mint leaves, or perfumed pastes, but the foul odor always returned. Worse still, medieval medical beliefs encouraged queens to purge their bodies after overeating. Induced vomiting was seen as healthy, a way to balance the humors. Some queens made themselves sick after feasts, damaging their throats and teeth even further. So while paintings show queens surrounded by luxury at the dining table, the truth was far from glamorous. Their feasts spread disease, their diets destroyed their teeth, and their breath was anything but royal. And as their mouths rotted and their bodies ached from poor diets, another filthy secret grew in plain sight. It was not in their food, but crawling in their hair, an infestation that no crown could hide. Few subjects were more taboo in the medieval world than menstruation. Yet for queens, their monthly bleeding carried both political weight and disgusting realities. This was another dark hygiene secret that royal portraits never reveal. Unlike today, there were no sanitary pads, no tampons, and no proper ways to manage menstrual blood. Medieval queens used scraps of cloth called rags, which they tucked beneath their gowns. These cloths were often reused for months at a time, poorly washed between cycles. Smell was impossible to ignore. Servants who handled laundry wrote of stains that never disappeared, and odors that clung to garments no matter how often they were boiled. Some queens, especially during long ceremonies, did not use cloths at all. They simply let the blood flow beneath their layers of clothing. Heavy gowns hid the stains, but the smell betrayed the truth. Courtiers often whispered about the unclean scent of women at court, and though no one dared accuse a queen openly, the rumor spread. Religion only made the matter worse. The church taught that menstruating women were impure. Queens were sometimes barred from receiving communion, or even from sleeping beside their husbands during their periods. Yet at the same time, queens were pressured to bear children, making their cycles a subject of constant observation. A missed period meant gossip about pregnancy, while excessive bleeding led to fears of weakness or divine punishment. Stranger still were the medical beliefs tied to menstruation. Physicians claimed menstrual blood carried poisons that could kill crops, sour wine, or even sicken men. Some advised burying used cloths far from the palace, while others recommended burning them to keep evil spirits away. In some cases, menstrual blood was bizarrely used in potions or cures, thought to have mystical powers. For the queens themselves, the experience was humiliating and filthy. There was no privacy. Servants washed their rags, kings noticed their absence from bed, and priests judged their purity. Behind their crowns, queens endured discomfort, odor, and shame, month after month. But menstrual filth was not the final secret. Because when queens tried to appear clean, they often relied on cosmetics and perfumes. Yet those very products were another source of sickness, rot, and disgust. The strange and often disgusting hygiene habits of medieval queens were not just about personal choice. They reflected a much deeper reality. Power came with a price, and that price was often paid by the women forced into these gilded cages. While kings could ride into battle, spend weeks on hunting trips, or simply refuse courtly duties, queens had to present themselves every single day as symbols of purity, grace, and perfection. The irony was cruel. Their perfection was often achieved through bizarre, painful, and downright unhygienic rituals. Many queens suffered lifelong health issues as a result. Skin rashes, rotting teeth, infertility, and even poisoning were not uncommon. Yet these women were trapped. Refusing the rituals meant being called unfit for royalty. Following them meant slow suffering in the shadows of their own palaces. And behind every banquet, every royal procession, every carefully painted portrait, there were private chambers filled with the stench of spoiled milk, the sting of harsh chemicals, and the cries of women enduring tortures in the name of beauty. This dark side of history is rarely told. The glittering crowns and royal gowns distract us from the truth. Queens were prisoners of their image, judged by impossible standards and forced into practices that harmed them far more than helped. Even worse, their suffering was often hidden, because to show weakness was to lose respect in a world dominated by men. The disgusting hygiene secrets weren't just quirks of history. They were evidence of a system that dehumanized women, turning them into ornaments while ignoring their pain. Every sweet-smelling perfume was masking rot. Every painted face was hiding scars. And every so-called secret was a silent cry for help from women who had no choice. But as we close in on the last secret, one question remains. Which of these practices was considered so important, so sacred, that queens risked their very lives for it? And why was it never spoken of in public? Medieval queens may have worn crowns of gold, but beneath the sparkle lay lives often marked by filth, stench, and disease. Their secrets remind us that power does not always come with comfort, and wealth does not guarantee cleanliness. These women, trapped in systems that prized appearances over health, carried their burdens in silence. What history left behind is not just their beauty or influence, but also the shocking realities they endured every single day. When we peel back the polished image of medieval courts, what remains is a world that smelled of sweat, blood, and perfume, desperately trying to mask it all. Their hygiene habits were not only strange, they were dangerous. And yet they endured, navigating survival in an age where ignorance about the body shaped every decision. So the next time we imagine a queen in silk gowns, walking through candlelit halls, we must remember the truth history tried to perfume away. Behind every crown lies a story, and sometimes it reeks of secrets too foul to ignore.